Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. After 15 years of working 60-hour weeks in the city, I finally had enough saved up to buy my dream getaway. It wasn't much to look at. A rundown cabin on 8 acres of wooded land about 2 hours outside the city. The place had been sitting empty for years after the original owner passed away and his kids just wanted it gone. Perfect for me, since I got it for a fraction of what a decent property would normally cost. The cabin itself needed serious work. The roof leaked, the plumbing was questionable, and there were more spider webs than I cared to count. But it had good bones, and more importantly, it had exactly what I was looking for. Peace and quiet. The nearest neighbor was barely visible through the trees, and I figured we'd probably never even cross paths. I spent my first weekend there just walking the property lines and making mental notes of everything that needed fixing. The deed mentioned some old stone walls and specific oak trees as boundary markers, which I found easily enough. Everything seemed straightforward until I started clearing overgrown brush from around the cabin's foundation. That's when I discovered the cord. It was a heavy-duty, weatherproof extension cord, the kind contractors use on job sites. One end was plugged into an outdoor outlet on the side of my cabin, and the other end disappeared into the woods toward where I thought my neighbor's property began. The thing had to be at least 100 feet long. At first, I figured it was some arrangement the previous owner had with his neighbor. Maybe they'd shared power for something, and the neighbor just forgot to unplug it when the old man died. No big deal. I unplugged it, coiled it up neatly, and left it on the ground next to the outlet. I went to bed that night feeling pretty good about my first day of cabin ownership. I had no idea I'd just kicked off a war. The next morning, I walked outside with my coffee to plan out the day's work and nearly choked on my first sip. The cord was plugged back in. Someone had come onto my property in the middle of the night and hooked it back up without so much as a note or explanation. Now I was genuinely confused. Maybe there was some misunderstanding about who owned what. I decided to be neighborly and walk over to introduce myself and clear things up. Following the cord through the woods was like following a bright orange breadcrumb trail. It led me right to the edge of my property and onto what was clearly the neighbor's land. The cord ended at a large workshop shed where I could hear power tools running. I knocked on the shed door and waited for the noise to stop. A woman in her 50s emerged, wearing work clothes and an expression that made it clear she wasn't thrilled about being interrupted. I introduced myself as the new owner of the cabin and explained that I'd found her extension cord plugged into my outlet. I was polite about it, figuring we could work out whatever arrangement she'd had with the previous owner. She barely glanced at me while I was talking. When I finished, she just shrugged and said the old man never minded her using a little power for her workshop. She acted like I was being unreasonable for even bringing it up. I explained that I'd be using the cabin regularly and wouldn't be comfortable with her drawing power from my property without some kind of arrangement. That's when her attitude really showed itself. She told me the outlet was practically on the property line anyway, and her family had been looking after this area for generations. She made it sound like I was some city intruder who didn't understand how things worked out here. Then she fired up a loud sander and turned her back on me, making it clear the conversation was over. I walked back to my cabin feeling like I'd been dismissed by some kind of woodland royalty. But fine, I thought. I'd made my position clear. Surely she'd respect that and find another power source. I unplugged the cord again and decided to take things a step further. Inside the cabin was an electrical panel with breakers for different circuits. I found the one for the outdoor outlets and switched it off. Problem solved. I locked up the cabin and drove back to the city, confident I'd handled things properly. I was severely underestimating my neighbor's sense of entitlement. When I returned the following weekend, I couldn't believe what I found. The lock on my electrical panel had been broken, not picked, but actually broken with what looked like bolt cutters. The breaker was flipped back on, and the cord was plugged in again. Even worse, there was a note wrapped around the cord in thick black marker that read, "Stop touching my cord, some of us have work to do." I stood there staring at that note for a full minute. This woman had come onto my property, broken into my electrical panel, and left me a threatening message about touching her cord. Her cord, plugged into my outlet, on my property. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a simple misunderstanding. This person genuinely believed she had the right to my electricity, and she was willing to commit what amounted to breaking and entering to keep taking it. A few days later, my first electric bill for the cabin arrived. For a place I'd barely used, where I'd run maybe a few lights and a coffee maker for a couple of hours each weekend, the bill was over $200. Her workshop was clearly drawing serious power. I knew confronting her again would be pointless. She'd already shown she didn't care about basic property rights or the law. If I wanted this to stop, I needed to be smarter about it. First, I bought a high-quality trail camera disguised as a birdhouse and mounted it where it had a clear view of both the outlet and the electrical panel. If she was going to keep trespassing and vandalizing my property, I wanted it documented. The camera paid for itself within 24 hours. I had crystal clear footage of my neighbor marching across my property like she owned it, breaking the new lock I'd installed on the electrical panel and plugging her cord back in. The timestamp showed she'd done it at 2 in the morning, probably thinking I wouldn't notice. But documentation was only part of my plan. I needed to establish beyond any doubt exactly where my property line was. I hired a licensed surveyor to come out and mark the boundaries with official stakes. The surveyor confirmed what I already knew from my deed. The cabin, the outlet, and a good 50 feet of woods beyond it were all on my property. He placed bright yellow stakes along the entire boundary line and gave me an official survey map that would hold up in any legal proceeding. With that foundation in place, I was ready for the main event. I called the power company and explained my situation. I told them I had a problem with someone stealing electricity from an outdoor outlet, and I wanted a separate meter installed just for that outlet. They were surprisingly accommodating. Apparently they deal with this kind of thing more often than you'd think. A week later, an electrician and a power company technician showed up to install what they called a sub-meter. This new meter was connected only to the single outdoor outlet my neighbor had been using. Everything else in the cabin remained on the original meter. The beauty of this setup was that I could track exactly how much power she was using without affecting my main electric service. And since it was all happening on my property with proper permits, everything was completely legal. I left the breaker on and the outlet accessible. For the next 2 months, I let my neighbor use all the power she wanted while the sub-meter dutifully recorded every kilowatt hour. The trail camera continued documenting her regular trespassing visits. During those 2 months, I learned just how extensive her power usage was. She wasn't just running a few hand tools. She had a full woodworking shop with table saws, planers, sanders, and industrial-grade equipment. Some nights, according to the camera timestamps, she'd work until 3 in the morning. The bills for the sub-meter were staggering. The first month was $460. The second month hit $520. She was using more electricity for her hobby workshop than most families use for their entire homes. I also used those 2 months to research the legal aspects of what she was doing. Theft of utilities is a serious crime in most places, and combined with the trespassing and property damage, she'd racked up quite a list of potential charges. By the end of the second month, I had everything I needed. The surveyor's official map showing clear property boundaries, dozens of time-stamped photos from the trail camera showing her trespassing and using my outlet, 2 official electric bills totaling just under $1,000 for power she'd stolen from my property. I compiled everything into a neat folder and chose a Saturday morning to pay my neighbor a visit. I found her and her husband working in their yard. She saw me coming and immediately got that defensive look on her face, probably expecting another complaint about her power usage. Instead, I walked up calmly and handed her husband the folder without saying a word. He opened it and started going through the contents while she peered over his shoulder. I watched their expressions change as they realized what they were looking at. The survey map showing the outlet was clearly on my property, the photographs of her trespassing and breaking my locks, the electric bills with her usage patterns highlighted. Her husband's face went from confusion to understanding to absolute fury in about 30 seconds. But his anger wasn't directed at me. He turned to his wife and demanded to know what she'd been thinking. She tried to argue that the old owner never minded, but he cut her off. He could see the documentation was ironclad, and he understood the legal implications immediately. I let them argue for a minute, then calmly explained their situation. They could pay me for the electricity she'd used, plus my costs for the surveyor and electrician. Or I could take the folder to the sheriff and let the legal system handle it. Their choice. The husband didn't hesitate. He told me to wait right there and disappeared into his house. 5 minutes later, he came back with a checkbook and asked how much I wanted. I'd done the math beforehand. The stolen electricity, the surveyor, the electrician, and a reasonable amount for my time and trouble came to just over $1,500. He wrote the check without arguing. His wife stood there looking like she'd been slapped. For 2 months, she'd been smugly stealing my power, probably thinking she'd outsmarted the clueless city guy. Now she was facing the reality that her petty theft had cost her family $1,500 and could have resulted in criminal charges. I took the check, thanked them for resolving the matter quickly, and walked back to my cabin. The first thing I did was call the power company to have the sub-meter removed. Then I had the electrician install a locking cover on the outlet that would require bolt cutters to break into. I also posted official no trespassing signs along the newly marked property line, just to make my position crystal clear. The check cleared without any problems, and I never saw my neighbor on my property again. She still used her workshop. I could hear the tools running sometimes, but she'd apparently figured out how to power it legally. A few weeks later, I installed motion-activated floodlights around the cabin as an extra deterrent. Not because I was worried about her coming back, but because I wanted to make sure any future visitors understood they were being watched. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with entitled people. Being polite and reasonable doesn't work when someone genuinely believes they have the right to take what's yours. Sometimes you need to be methodical and let the facts speak for themselves. I spent that first summer really fixing up the cabin. New roof, updated plumbing, fresh paint throughout. Every weekend became a productive mix of work and relaxation. The peace and quiet I'd originally sought were finally mine. The best part was sitting on my front porch in the evenings, listening to nothing but birds and wind in the trees. No city noise, no entitled neighbors demanding access to my property. Just the tranquility I'd worked 15 years to afford. Looking back, I'm almost grateful my neighbor tried to steal my power. If she'd been reasonable from the start, I never would have gone through the process of getting my property professionally surveyed and documented. I wouldn't have learned about utility theft laws or how to properly secure outdoor electrical outlets. Her sense of entitlement ended up costing her $1,500 and taught me valuable lessons about protecting my property. In the end, I came out ahead in every way that mattered. The cabin has been my sanctuary for 3 years now, and I've never had another problem with neighbors or trespassers. The trail camera is still there, hidden in its fake birdhouse, keeping a silent watch over my little piece of paradise. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry or escalating a conflict. Sometimes it's just being patient, gathering evidence, and letting entitled people face the natural consequences of their actions. My neighbor learned that lesson the expensive way, and I got exactly what I'd paid for. A peaceful retreat where I could enjoy my weekends without worrying about someone stealing my electricity. Update. 6 months later, I figured I should update this since a few people asked what happened after I got my neighbor to pay for the stolen electricity. The short answer is that karma kept working, and things got even better for me. About 3 months after the whole power theft incident, I was out working on my deck when I heard shouting from next door. Through the trees, I could see my neighbor and her husband having what looked like a pretty heated argument in their driveway. I minded my own business, but it was loud enough that I couldn't help overhearing some of it. Apparently, her expensive workshop hobby had been causing problems in their marriage for a while. The $1,500 she'd cost them by stealing my power was just the final straw. Her husband had been complaining about the money she spent on tools and materials, and now she'd managed to add theft and potential criminal charges to the mix. A few weeks later, I noticed the workshop had gone quiet. No more late-night power tool sounds, no more sawing and sanding. When I walked by their property line during one of my evening walks, I could see through the shed windows that most of the equipment was gone. It turns out she'd been forced to sell her entire workshop setup to help pay for their mortgage. The husband had apparently put his foot down about her expensive hobby after the power theft fiasco. She'd gone from stealing my electricity to power thousands of dollars worth of equipment to having no equipment at all. But the best part came 2 months ago. I was at the local hardware store picking up supplies for a bathroom renovation when the clerk mentioned that the property next to mine was going up for sale. Sure enough, when I got back to the cabin that weekend, there was a for sale sign in my neighbor's front yard. I did some discreet asking around and learned that they were getting divorced. Apparently, the power theft incident had exposed a lot of financial problems in their marriage, and things had spiraled from there. The property sold within a month to a nice retired couple from the city who were looking for the same kind of peace and quiet I'd been seeking. I introduced myself when they moved in, and we've had several pleasant conversations over the fence. They're respectful, quiet neighbors who understand property boundaries. They also mentioned that the previous owners had left behind some interesting stories about disputes with neighbors. The real estate agent had apparently warned them about potential boundary issues, which led to them doing their own survey before buying. Smart move. The irony isn't lost on me that my original neighbor's sense of entitlement about my electricity ended up costing her not just $1,500, but her marriage, her hobby, and eventually her entire home. All because she couldn't respect a simple property line and thought she was entitled to free power. Meanwhile, my cabin has appreciated significantly in value since I fixed it up. The professional survey I got during the power theft investigation turned out to be incredibly valuable when I applied for permits for a small addition I'm planning. Having official boundary markers and documentation saved me time and money on the approval process. I've also become something of a local expert on property rights and utility theft. 2 other people in the area have contacted me for advice when they've had similar problems with entitled neighbors. It feels good to help people protect their property and stand up for themselves. The trail camera is still doing its job, though these days it mostly captures wildlife. I've gotten some amazing photos of deer, foxes, and even a black bear that wandered through last fall. It's a much better use of the surveillance equipment than documenting trespassing neighbors. I finished the bathroom renovation last month, and I'm planning to tackle the kitchen next summer. Every improvement I make adds value to the property and makes it more enjoyable for my weekend retreats. The place has truly become everything I hoped it would be when I first bought it. Looking back, I'm genuinely grateful for how everything worked out. If my original neighbor had been reasonable and respected my property from the start, I never would have learned so much about legal protections for property owners. I wouldn't have gotten the professional survey that's proven so valuable for other projects, and I definitely wouldn't appreciate my current peaceful neighbors as much as I do. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my deck in the evenings, I think about how different things could have been if she'd just knocked on my door that first weekend and asked politely about working out some kind of arrangement for power. I probably would have been willing to discuss it, maybe even help her run proper electrical service to her workshop. Instead, her entitled attitude and illegal behavior cost her everything while teaching me valuable lessons about protecting what's mine. She thought she could intimidate the clueless city guy into letting her steal my electricity. Instead, she ended up losing her hobby, her marriage, and her home. The best part is that justice happened naturally. I didn't have to pursue criminal charges or take her to court beyond getting my money back. Her own actions created consequences that were far worse than anything I could have imposed. These days, the only sounds I hear from next door are the occasional lawnmower and my new neighbors working peacefully in their garden. No more power tools running at 2 in the morning, no more entitled attitudes about property boundaries, just the quiet country life I'd always wanted. My cabin has become exactly what I dreamed it would be, a peaceful retreat where I can work on projects, enjoy nature, and recharge from city life. And I never have to worry about someone stealing my electricity to make it happen. Sometimes standing up to entitled people requires patience and strategy rather than confrontation. In this case, letting my neighbor hang herself with her own actions worked out better than any revenge I could have planned. Justice served itself, and I came out ahead in every possible way. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Let's call him Joe. I have to call him something, the man I ruined, but I can't call him by his real name, so let's call him Joe. Joe was a wife beater. I was hired by Joe's brother-in-law, the brother of the wife that Joe beat. My client was also Joe's ex-business partner. Aside from the whole "you beat up my sister" thing, my client had another beef with Joe, a serious business beef. My client took it to court and gave me the case to handle. Joe was confident that his bullcrap and outright perjury would carry the day. It had always worked before. His bullcrap and his fists had won him a good settlement with his ex-wife, free of child support. So maybe he thought that threats and lies would carry the day once more. But he was wrong. And after the trial, I had a judgment against him. A big judgment, far bigger than he could pay. Joe twisted and he turned and he shimmied and shaked, but after a while I'd located and taken all his assets. It was easy, really. Joe had no thought of consequences, and so he didn't lawyer up until it was too late. If one of my clients ever sues you, you're in trouble, because my clients lawyer up before they even know your name. But Joe didn't lawyer up until the process server threw the papers at his feet, and by then, it was far too late. I went through Joe's assets like a meat grinder, and after a while, Joe had but one property left, a house, and he clung to that house, for it was rented out and his sole source of income. Joe lived in the unfinished basement, and he survived on what the upstairs tenants paid him. He cashed their rent checks at payday loan places, paying hefty fees, but it was worth it because he knew that I'd garnish any bank account that he opened. Joe managed to hide his rental place from me for a while because he owned it through a numbered company, but my investigator found him one day and followed him home. Joe self-repped his way through the next stage, which took a couple of years, while I punctured his corporate veils and his sad efforts at a fraudulent conveyance. But in the end, I had his last house, the house where he lived in the unfinished basement. Joe stepped out one day to get a pack of cigarettes, and when he came back, the sheriff had changed the locks. "Can my client at least live in the basement?" Joe's lawyer said to me, pro bono, because by this point Joe had nothing to pay lawyers. I knew the pro bono guy. He practiced law nearby. As I was talking to him, I could see pro bono guy's office window across the parking lot from my office tower window. Ask the purchaser, I said. It's out of my hands. And it was. I told Joe's lawyer that the new owner, a nominee, one of my client's employees, wouldn't let him back into his crappy basement apartment. Joe, a man who had owned this and that here and there and all over town, had just lost the last thing he owned on earth. Except for his truck. He still had his truck left. Joe's truck was this big-ass gas-guzzling beast that he drove around in. It was too old and too frail to be worth seizing, so I let Joe keep it, and I was glad I did that because now the truck was where Joe slept, until he made a mistake and lost his truck too. He lost his truck the day I got a phone call from the tenants at the house that Joe used to own. He came back and parked his truck across the driveway, the tenant said, adding that Joe had gone nuts. He'd parked his truck there in a rage out of spite and then walked into town saying he'd be back later that day to sleep in his truck. Can you get around the truck? I asked. The tenant could not. The driveway was blocked. I called one of the tow truck guys that I used to defend back in my criminal lawyer days, and in a couple of hours that truck was gone and parked somewhere else, somewhere special, in accordance with my specific instructions. My guy wants his truck back, the pro bono lawyer said the next day when he called me. Not happening, I said. I stood in my office 15 floors above the parking lot and looked down where I imagined my pro bono counterpart was standing in his office, facing the same lot. But you have no right to the truck, he said. He has no right to block a man's driveway, I replied. It was terrible, really, standing up high, pronouncing words that took away a man's final asset, the last thing he owned on earth. I imagined that this must be what God feels like before he strips a man of everything and sends him to hell. Are you really going to make me go to court over this? Said Pro Bono Guy. Do what you got to do, I said, and Pro Bono Guy said his client was coming in the next day to sign an affidavit, and then they were going to court to get the truck back. But I was unconcerned. The next day was bright and the sun was shining, and it was 9 a.m. as I looked out the window and sipped my coffee. My phone rang. I picked up. It was Pro Bono Man. Why didn't you tell me that Joe's truck was parked right outside my office? His voice was tight, and I could tell that he must have been shaking with anger. Is that so? I said, staring out at Joe's truck parked 15 stories below me. How careless of my bailiff to leave the truck where your client could easily take it back. I really must speak to him. Very funny. My client's going to sue. No, he isn't. He's going to get in that truck and drive away right now. I told my tow guy to fill up the tank, and he gave it an oil change too, gratis. Tell your client to get in his truck and drive off, and that if I ever see that truck again, I'll seize it to satisfy the rest of my client's judgment. Pro Bono Guy tried to argue, but I was firm. Then I put the phone down and picked up my coffee. A few minutes later, Joe walked out of his lawyer's office and over to his truck. As he walked, I saw that there was no longer a bounce to his step. The joy had gone out of him. Joe wasn't the first guy I ruined, and he won't be the last, but he is the only one whose final ruin I witnessed from on high. From my office, and it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, watching a man walk to his truck, knowing that I had stripped him of everything else he had, and that he owed his possession of his last asset, his truck, to my mercy. Joe drove away, his big-ass ancient truck spilling clouds of smoke from the exhaust. I was pretty sure I'd never hear from him again, and I never did. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I've worked at an accounting firm for 6 years. For the first 5 years, whenever I'd have a notable interaction with a client, I'd log this on a shared spreadsheet that I created. Everyone I worked with had access to this, and you could literally just CTRLF the account information and find whatever you needed. Super simple. If ever my manager Zara needed a quick update on an account, she'd call me and I'd give her all the information she needed. At the 5-year mark, I'd managed to annoy Sarah by cutting back on attending optional social-only outings despite having made them aware I do suffer with social anxiety and was off my medication. I was polite and professional in work as usual, just declined optional work outings. Side note, I tried for years, but it was a lot of cattiness. I'd even been sexually harassed, gaslit about it, and even openly insulted at these events before I decided no more. Off the back of this annoyance, Sarah decided that my spreadsheet was too intricate and time-consuming to access, and it needed to be logged upon the accounting system itself, alongside my spreadsheet. The accounting system was often slow, at times non-functional. The logging process was moderately time-consuming, but slowed my role majorly to have to fully pull up each account just to update an email trail. I initially pushed back and asked why the sudden change, how was loading a spreadsheet more complex, this wasn't how I was trained, etc. Sarah told me it was easier for her to see notes on the accounts themselves. I asked why this has suddenly become a problem after 5 years. She had no answer other than she'd always preferred them on the account, but now she wants to action it. I started logging notes on the system begrudgingly, alongside my spreadsheet. Sarah continued to use my spreadsheet regularly. She would also continue to call for updates even when I had made 2 sets of notes for her convenience. She never checked my notes on the accounting system, but I continued to log. It was only when I noticed none of my coworkers were being asked to log to the extent I was that I started slowly reverting back to my spreadsheet. Sarah didn't care about this at all, but was prone to mood swings. When she would be having a bad day, she would remember how to check notes on the accounting system just to call me up and berate me for not having logged them. Sometimes I would push back with points made above, but she wouldn't even address this. Occasionally I'd get an I know, and then she would just continue on her rants about how it just needs doing. The straw came for me when Sarah was having a particularly challenging period, called me up, and basically threatened my employment should I not log each interaction I made to her specifications. Quite frankly, with all listed above, I am done with this place. I have put things in place to leave and will be doing so before the year is over. However, with regards to this particular issue, I decided to comply maliciously. I logged every single interaction, every pointless email, every nothing CC, every call, every text. If I had so much as a one-word okay from a customer, it went everywhere I could squeeze text into on the accounting system. I started writing brief abbreviations that only I could understand on my spreadsheet so that I could quickly find the information I needed, but Sarah would have to wade through 20 emails, transcripts, and texts to find what she needed. It took a lot of my time to manage, but I persevered. Other areas did suffer, but Sarah didn't care about that. Sarah was just happy I had submitted to her ever-changing whims. I also grew a backbone when Sarah would call and would insist heavily that she check my notes on the accounting system, as suddenly I am just oh so forgetful and wouldn't want to leave out any important information. She knew what I was doing, but she couldn't do a thing about it. As I'd told several coworkers about how happy I was, Sarah pushed me to use the accounting system, how smart she was, it saved me so much time, etc. My good times with watching her sift through countless texts and emails came to an end last month. After 6 months of watching her wade through the ocean of emails, transcripts, and texts I would leave on each of my accounts. I checked my emails one morning to find that Sarah had, without any communication, scheduled a one weekly occurrence meeting with me, solely to get updates on all my accounts. I accepted the invite with glee and waited for it to roll around. When the meeting commenced, Sarah pulled out a notebook where she had been keeping every query on my accounts she had over the past week. It was surprisingly extensive, but I imagine she'd been stockpiling a lot longer than a week to be petty, and also to avoid using her convenient new logging method. I listened and nodded, customer service smile on my face while she explained how it needed to be a meeting because sometimes I just don't have time to check notes. And I think it's easier for all of us to do it this way, I agreed, wholeheartedly. A smug smile crept across her face, and she told me the first account she would need an update on. Without skipping a beat or allowing one crack in my customer service smile, I put on my screen share, and it showed the account she had queried on accounting system with the Notes tab open. She smug smile dropped, replaced by a look of poorly composed, white-hot, seething rage. I then, bar for bar, read the entirety of the relevant notes on the account. No paraphrasing, no deviation from the written text whatsoever. Same with the next account and the next. By the time the call had concluded, Sarah had a face like thunder, and didn't even say goodbye when the call ended. The following day, there was a team-wide email issued with the subject, Urgent Notes Update. It was a one-paragraph email about how due to some site issues, the accounting system was no longer suitable to store our notes, and we are to return to the prior system of keeping our own records. I'm still leaving, but that look on Sarah's face will be enough to placate me until I do. The next one is an entitled people story. So this has been bugging me for a while, and I need to vent. People from this culture may relate. My wife's uncle has somehow made it his life's mission to critique every single woman who marries into the family. Not in a, oh, he gives advice way. No, he straight up monitors people. If a wife isn't cooking enough, dressing modestly enough, serving her in-laws daily, or being the picture-perfect housewife by his outdated standards, he makes snide comments or lectures them like he's running a finishing school for the 1950s. It's always subtle at first. Oh, you don't cook every day? Or, back in our time, women didn't talk like that. But then it escalates. If someone has a career or speaks their mind or, God forbid, doesn't cater to their in-laws 24/7, he claims they're single-handedly destroying family values. He once even said that a wife should be grateful her husband allows her to work, and if people push back or ignore his judgment, he sulks, full-on cold shoulders, guilt-tripping, acting all hurt like he's the victim. He absolutely despises his sister's DIL, who is an engineer at a reputable company, earns crap loads, stays long hours, and visits her family for the weekend, which doesn't align with his vision. But then, here's the kicker. He still expects to be invited to every wedding, dinner, and get-together like he didn't just alienate half the family with his behavior. You could invite him 15 minutes before the event and he will be there. At one event, he claimed that giving the new generation high-quality education is why no one is having kids and everyone is working too much. This is coming from a guy that stayed in one company for 40 years, never planned for his family's future, never properly educated his kids, and is now mooching off his poor son that is paying for the entire household of 10 people. Everyone sees it. Everyone complains about it behind closed doors, but no one wants to be the one to cause drama because people would justify that he is old, so he keeps getting away with it, and honestly, it just makes every gathering a little more exhausting. Anyway, thank you for watching.